Hey guys, it's miicrow here. I wanted to talk about some of the recent dev updates that have been happening, some changes that have been happening in the new world, new direction that's going to be incoming, kind of culminate all that into one video. This would have gone out today, or I guess yesterday for you guys, like the day after these videos aired, but I had some technical difficulties, so I wanted to talk about some of this stuff. The most important thing I think, is testing the actual bugs itself. So there was a bug where if you were to look at the split scaling, but where you can see if I do an auto attack here and it says 366, 366, that used to do more damage in PvP to the elemental side than to the physical side, and that has been fixed. That was the reason why Boltcaster was hitting super hard. Boltcaster is effectively nerfed by about 20%, which is what was intended, and feels very different, especially with the other changes that are coming to, or that came to bow rather, where you're not able to actually animation cancel rain of arrows out of every single attack, or so AGS and everyone thought. Sadly, this is still exploitable. Immediately once this exploit was fixed, another one was found with rain of arrows, and you could still basically do the same thing. So effectively, no change in the rain of arrows, but at least Boltcaster is not going to be hitting you like a complete truck, and there's still, I guess, that skill-based element for people who like that kind of mechanic where you're able to go for advanced animation cancels by queuing an ability, dequeuing the ability, and then going for attacks. There's also another one with bow right now where you're able to go for heavy attacks and heavy attacks. Both of these I am not able to show because I don't know how you do them, and Dex players are generally not very open with sharing exploits for obvious reasons, I guess. They want to have the advantage, and they gain that advantage by basically being secondary QA for AGS and finding exploits by testing random things. So that is what happened there, which is not ideal. In terms of other things that are still bugged, there's a bug in terms of the scaling with other stats than are intended. So, for example, if I have this amber gem in here for the butcher sword, if I do an attack, that 43 damage that you see as a dot, that's supposed to be 8% damage. It's actually a bit less than that right now. It's ticking for about 6% damage, even though it says 8%, which is not ideal. I have that math written out here. So that's 43 damage, 672 normally. So that's about 6% damage per tick, even though it says on here that it's 8% damage per tick, which shows that that's bugged. That seems minor for that case, but where it really turns out to be annoying is the Inferno. If I do a kind of flamethrower thing here, I have nothing spec on the Inferno except for flamethrower. I'm ticking for 26 with no stats in play. If I were to up the strength pretty significantly, say I go for 100 strength, I don't think any of these passives are going to be applying, so that should work. And you'll see that the burn damage is still doing 26. So this is still fundamentally bugged, and is the reason why artifacts like the Inferno doesn't feel very good to use. Pest doesn't feel very good to use from a damage side of things. Things like the Butcher, even with like gems in them, don't feel very good to use. Life Taker doesn't feel very good to use, and just in general, artifacts have this bug that's kind of making them not viable for some degree. And I was hoping that would get fixed in the same patch because it's kind of tangential to how that calculation works. But it appears that AGS has kind of done the minimum here, fixed the one bug with the Boltcaster, kind of missed the boat there, where elemental damage as a whole is bugged right now and is not actually doing the damage that it says it does according to the tooltip. So either the tooltip needs to change, which would be the stupidest way to fix it possible, would just be to change the tooltip and say, hey, this actually depends on what scaling you do, or to go back and change how the values actually work. Now, another bug that was introduced, if you look at the kind of stat scaling that was introduced, which can be determined from a file from the in-game data, you could actually see that there's supposed to be scaling that is reducing the damage in PvP for fire staff like burn ticks and stuff like that. Off of testing I did yesterday, which I can't show in front of me right now because I would have to duel someone. It turns out that the int scaling and the dot based effects for int are actually resulting in more damage per tick than going for something with no damage associated with it. So if you start with like a 0 int, for example, and then you increase the int overall, that actual burn damage it's going to be coming is not affected from the PvP modifier, which means that burn damage is doing more damage than it should, which is again another reason why Fire Staff feels a little bit more broken than it probably should be, because its damage should be reduced on the burn side by approximately like 7 to 8% compared to what it is right now, which again is like about where bow used to be and why bow felt really strong. It's like Firestaff's doing more damage than intended. Something like the blunderbuss, for example, is also doing more damage than intended, although a highly debated topic within the road community. It seems like at this point, I didn't think it was, but I still don't think blunderbuss does enough damage. It does good damage in OPR, but I think that's because of the combination of the build that's being run right now, the Great Axe and BB with Crippling Reap, and how that synergy just works with blunderbuss is just really good for an OPR based build. But for builds with, or in situations with more coordination, blunderbuss is virtually not playable right now, just because perks like Frigid Dawn are just able to hard counter it, and that is just meta right now, as well as like other conditioning based perks. So those things are kind of how the bugs have panned out recently. I have some notes here on terms of the PvP setup in terms of what has actually changed from the recent dev video. If you guys haven't seen it, if you go to the Discord here, I have the dev video here where we're saying bye to Dave, or saying hello to 2 new combat devs. We wish you luck. We'll miss Dave, because I like Dave a lot, because he was just like kind of forthcoming. Like he just said like stuff and didn't really bullshit that much, which I appreciated, because I think a lot of people like the bullshit, which makes sense. It just makes you sound better if you can bullshit. But Dave's like, oh no, like, these are the problems. We're gonna be trying to fix them. Like it's just like straight up, and like I appreciate that kind of aspect. But in general, combat is going to be normalized around medium. So what that means is, if you look here on the equip load side, you can see that there's all these random bonuses for light, medium, and heavy. From a new player perspective, it's like, oh my god, what is happening? What does each class offer? It's like very hard to kind of gauge like what each class does quickly. And medium is going to be that baseline. There's going to be less tooltips, everything there. Everything's going to be normalized around medium. This still isn't fixing the issue that is making heavy super viable in any coordinated environment. Light is still going to be viable, I think, no matter what, because people just like the dodge from movement, which is why it's preferred to use in like open world and OPR, where movement is a way to escape early, just because you're able to create more distance. But the fact that the base damage percentage is not an actual percent modifier, it's adding to a common bucket, is resulting in the fact that light just effectively does not do the damage that's required to outpace heavy in terms of survivability. And it makes sense to go for heavy for every single build in the game except for healing, because healing's modifier is actually multiplicative, versus everything else is adding to a very common bucket and then scaling, which effectively means that light, even though it says it's doing 20% more damage, for most builds in the game is doing about 10 to 12% more damage. And when you're comparing 10 to 12% more damage in return for taking about 20% more damage, to even more than that per hit, it just does not really make sense to go light for a lot of builds. That's something that I think definitely needs to be worked on in the future, and I don't think is on the radar from an AGS perspective so far. There's also going to be change to a Lifestaff, which is really interesting, or at least they're talking about it, where this left side is going to be focused on healing, this right side is going to be focused on kind of proactive damage mitigation. So maybe we see something like Light's Embrace change here, which I think is a really cool idea, because then it turns Lifestaff potentially into less of like a heal bot / timing oriented class to more of a support class with like sort of utility of sorts, which I'm a big fan of as someone that like played Overwatch a lot. Like every support character there is called a support for a reason. They're not called a healer because they actually have utility and allows them to interact with the game in more ways than a typical game would allow. That concept I think is a little bit foreign to MMOs, but is going to be interesting to see how they do this nonetheless. The only kind of words of wisdom I would say about this is Void Gauntlet has the ability to completely negate every single effect in the game that goes on there proactively due to Nullifying Oblivion. And if the devs aren't careful about that, effectively that right tree will just not be viable from PvP whatsoever, and everyone will just go left tree, because it's sort of what's happening right now. Heals are not strippable, but basically every other effect in the game is, and this causes problems down the road. So really cool idea. We'll see how this kind of applies. There's going to be passives that are going to be scaling from one weapon to another. This is really cool because traditionally in the game right now, you have classes that are sort of just offhands, and you have classes that are main hands. Rapier, for example, within PvP, noteworthy within PvE, Blood Rapier is fantastic. Omnidirectional Rapier is fantastic. The problem is people have cleanse spots in PvP, which means that these builds are not as good. But things like Rapier are really, really set as a defensive kind of secondary weapon that allows you to escape, kind of allows you to reposition. Things like the Ice Gauntlet are purely just used defensively. There's some utility there from Ice Shower too, of course, but Tomb is just really, really good defensively. Shower is really good defensively. And in general, there's just some weapons that just aren't good enough as a primary weapon right now. Like Hatchet, in general, is not a good enough weapon as a primary weapon because the tracking isn't as good, which they're also looking at fixing. They're going to make heavies a little bit more sticky, which could help. And I think in general, they're just going to be working on that like tracking aspect to make sure that works, which is great because Hatchet, it feels like you can't hit someone that's like literally a foot in front of you half the time, but it does have an upside of like doing significant amounts of damage, which is why it's sometimes used in PvE, albeit usually people go rapier greatsword, but hatchet is definitely viable for certain encounters for mutations. And like by viable I mean it's good in speedrunning. Like every like hatchet is fantastic in general, very easy to play, very effective at low con, which is usually what you want for PvE, but that kind of secondary aspect of being able to speedrun is not as good in certain situations as other builds, but still is viable nonetheless. So it's cool to see like them potentially look at that, make some things kind of translate from one weapon to another. We already have this in the game to some degree with the flail. This reinforced vitality passive applies to both weapons, which is super nice. This best friends passive applies to both weapons, which is super nice. And this reductive superiority passive applies to both weapons, which is super nice. So you can kind of get these off. I believe Human Shield actually might do it as well, but you can kind of get these effects off so your secondary and still get value, which is one of the reasons why Flail is kind of interestingly viable for certain roles like tank, where traditionally you had to run an Ice Gauntlet because it has this additional utility that wasn't present typically with other classes, which is really, really neat. They're also going to be looking at magic weapons. So if you look at your mana bar right now, most people just forget that this exists. They just pop mana food. They have health pots on bar, or like, sorry, not health pots. They have infused mana pots on bar. They run like infused regen potions, which also generate mana, and then you basically just press buttons the entire time, and you can have your lovely dose of ADHD reduction with just button mashing, and you don't even have to worry about mana. Or you just forget that mana exists, and all of a sudden you're out of mana, and you just can't regenerate it at all. They're going to be addressing that and fixing that. It'll be interesting to see if they kind of go against their philosophy here, because they're talking about mitigating burst potential with this. But this, in theory, if you're going to make it so that abilities cost more mana, but you generate mana more quickly, I would hope that they would do more damage, and that could lead to situations where you have the option to go for burst or the option to not go for burst, depending on what you want to do with your mana. And that will be interesting to see if they kind of implement that to some degree, and you see like mage weapons become these kind of burst oriented weapons, like Firestaff. Maybe you go for Fireball and the Pillar of Fire, see those damage spikes, see if you can get any kills off of that. But it sounds like they're moving away from that direction. They're trying to make damage and healing a little bit more stable, have the game slow down a bit. Less of these like, hey, how did I die there? Go back, rewind, 0.25, count every single effect in the game. I realize there's nothing that you can do, and that you were just in a bad situation. If you were in that bad situation, you won't die. So it'll be interesting to see how they kind of address that stuff in practice. But overall, it seems like the direction from the long term is definitely there. It's very clear with New World right now, though, that there's not going to be a lot of content till May. And just in general, the game is in a spot where I think it's sort of transitioning to be more of a seasonal game of sorts. The devs need to develop technology that wasn't there at launch, that probably should have been there on launch. They don't want to put the game like on hold. They don't want to like, prevent it from being a live service game and work on these issues. They're just trying to do the minimal support that they can while they're developing these issues, either for New World in May, or perhaps for Lord of the Rings in the future when AGS kind of takes over for that game. But the future in the long term looks good. The future in the short term, still not very impressed. Still kind of think that AGS needs some sort of secondary a QA team to kind of catch bugs that the players just know about but just aren't being addressed. It doesn't seem like the Discord is very helpful, which is why I sadly kind of have to make YouTube videos about this stuff, because it seems like the more YouTube videos I make, the more people actually realize that these things are issues and they actually get addressed, which is an unfortunate use of the platform, but a blessing and a curse. So we'll get through it maybe and get some of these bugs fixed and get to a spot where maybe the Inferno will once be played and will actually be cool, instead of like having to run BB with as an offhand with passed on every single fire stat, because it's just better in general. But with that being said, I'll leave you guys there. Let me know what you guys think. I'm probably going to be trying to make some videos on some other games that I'm playing in the meantime for like break material. But a New World definitely is in a interesting spot, and we'll see what the future holds. So peace out.